Straight Life by Art and Lori Pepper. This is episode 53 of Straight Life. In episode 52, Art, strung out and desperate, is asked by a couple of friends if he wants to take part in a burglary. They want to break into a nightclub right behind the place Art and Diane are renting in North Hollywood. Here's episode 53, The Caper. Here's Art's narrative. About a week before the job, Diane and I left the house. We didn't tell the landlady. We went and stayed with Frank in East L.A. We took everything out of the house, but we moved our stuff just a little at a time so the neighbors wouldn't know we were leaving and notify the landlady. We had to have access to the house to burglarize the nightclub. They decided to do it on a Saturday night, actually Sunday morning. We drove out there in the Thunderbird. Frank had a black leather jacket on and a pair of black slacks, and he was wearing a hat, a stingy brim hat. He was a dapper cat. There were 2 guns, and I wasn't allowed to have one. They were afraid with my inexperience I might get nervous and fire when there was no need to, which was a drag for me. I felt I should have one, just in case. I was voted out of having a gun. We parked in back and entered the house through the back door. We didn't turn on any lights. We used candles. When it got to be about 2:30, Frank went down the street to a payphone and called the club. Somebody answered. He asked about reservations and came back. At 3:15, he called again, and there was no answer. He waited and called again. No answer. He let it ring and ring. Then he walked by the club and looked at it from all sides. There were no lights, no cars in the lot. He came back to the house and said, "Everything is ready. There's no one there." The plan was to cut a hole in the wall. The hole would come out in the kitchen area. They would go from there into the club itself, search that, take whatever was stashed, and then go upstairs into the manager's office where the safe was with the money. Reuben was one of the best safe men in East L.A. Guys would pull burglaries. They would have the hole already drilled and cut, and then they'd go get Reuben to open the safe. Frank said to me, "You're going to be the lookout. That means I want you to look out the front windows and the side windows and keep circulating. Keep your ears open. If you hear anything, take this flashlight and signal us." I saw them getting the tools out and I said, "Why do you have to go through the wall?" They said, "You can't go through the doors because there's alarms on the doors. You have to go through the roof or a hole in the wall." They went out and started the hole. I could see them from the bedroom window. Their manner was very businesslike. They didn't waste any time. It was almost like surgeons working, chisel, wire cutters. The side of the building was stucco, but every so often, as they went through the wall, they'd find a big piece of wire mesh. I think there were about 3 of them to make the wall strong. And each time they came to the mesh, they had to cut. They had to make a hole large enough for a body to get through. It was hard work, and every now and then I'd hear an "ow" when they'd cut themselves or when they'd be straining to bend the wire back. I'm listening, pointing, and it's very spooky at this time of the morning, very cold and damp. I'm walking around this abandoned house that's just a mess, with the broken pill bottles on the floor and a few old pieces of furniture. I'd wanted to fix before we did the job, but they had rationed the dope out. We'd fixed at around 9 o'clock, so we'd be clear-headed. After a certain length of time, about 3 or 4 hours after you fix, you become very aware, keenly aware. And as you start to get sick, you really become conscious and super sensitive to everything, feelings, sounds. They kept working. It seemed like forever. And then I heard, I think that's it. Yeah, I think so. They both came into the house and Frank said, all right, we're going in. You've got to be really careful now, man. If anything happens, you got to run to the hole and holler inside. Both of them put handkerchiefs around their faces, and they took their guns out. Frank went first and then Reuben, really not knowing if there was someone waiting inside. I kept running from the back of the house to the front into the yard, listening, watching, and every now and then I'd hear a car or a siren. Finally, they came to the hole and called for me. They had a bundle, bottles of whiskey, and they had a bag full of change, money from the machines, cigarette machines, and things like that. We put it in the car. I said, is everything all right? Reuben said, I don't know, man. Frank said, there's an office upstairs, just like I thought, where the money is, but the door to the office is locked and it's wired. There's an alarm system into the office. And I don't know, there could be someone hiding in there, sleeping in there. We were standing in the bedroom of the house. They were debating what to do. And I was thinking that we'd gone through all this hassle and we weren't going to get anything. Reuben said, well, I think I can take care of the alarm. Run it back into itself. Rewire it. I said to Frank, why don't you give me a gun? Let me go into the office. I really wanted to do something that would be exciting and dangerous, and I really needed the money. Frank said, I'll do it. That's okay. Reuben went in. After a while, he came back to the hole and said, everything's cool. I got the thing turned around. Frank went in and he said, keep your fingers crossed. They had hoped to have everything done while it was still dark. Now it wouldn't be long before daylight, and I'm getting panicked. We should have already been out of there, long gone out of there. We don't know if a silent alarm has been tripped, if the police are sneaking up to get us coming out with the stuff. Here I am without a gun. I can see myself getting hung with the whole thing and them getting away. I'm standing out there by the hole, and all of a sudden, here's Reuben, and he's got a big smile on his face. He says, help me out of here, man. He was too tired to push out of the hole. I pulled him and I said, what happened? And here comes Frank. He says, here, take this. He hands out a box, a little box. And I say, what's this? He says, that's it. He comes out and I say, that's it? He says, that's it. And the money wasn't in a safe. It was in a strong box. He handed me this box, and boy, my heart was pounding, and I said, is this it? He said, yeah, man, we really lucked out. There was no one there, and everything's cool. Let's get out of here. We covered the hole with brush to keep it from being visible. We got into the car, and Frank said to me, why don't you drive, man? Both of them were tired and cut up from breaking into the hole. It was daylight now. I got on the freeway, the same freeway I'd taken my little excursion on when I decided to go back to my dope fiend life. There's no cops, no black and whites, no motorcycles. And so after we'd traveled a certain distance, I realized that we had made it. I looked over at Frank and said, man, let me have a drink. He handed me one of the bottles with the pouring spouts on them. I took 4 big shots. I was already starting to get sick. I was really strung out. But I was so happy. We were driving along and Frank opens the box and says, wow. I look over and I see that there's just stacks of money. I felt so happy. I had never felt any elation like that before. It was a feeling of power, a feeling of accomplishment. I really felt like a man. I don't think I've ever been so satisfied with anything I've done. I looked at the other people on the streets and I thought, they ain't nothing compared to me. I'm a giant. King Pepper, King Arthur, Mr. Jazz, Mr. Everything. We went to Reuben's house. He had a place in back of his parents', a little shed. Sometimes he'd go back there with guys to fix, and his parents knew he did that with his friends. It was cool to do that. We went in to count the money. Naturally, I wouldn't get as big a share as they did. They were the brains behind the thing. They had the guns. They had the plan. They had cut me in. I had done a good job, but naturally, I wouldn't get as much as they did. We counted up the money. They were going to throw the checks away, but I said, no, let me have them. They said, you've got to be awfully careful. You've got to hold them for a while. And when you finally do pass them, you've got to be careful where you pass them. And if anything happens, that's you, period. I said, I know that. You don't have to worry about me. They said, well, you've been in prison. You know what it's all about. And I did. It made me happy that they trusted me, and I had no worry about my ability to stand up under a bust and to take whatever I had to take. I said, let me have the checks. Frank gave them to me, and then he handed me a little money sack. I didn't question or count or anything. Whatever I got was what I deserved. We left Reuben at the pad, and then Frank and I got in his car and went to his house where I was staying. The Mexicans that are married have a life separate from their wives. The wife stays home and takes care of the kids and the house, and the man goes out. That's the way it's always been. The wife doesn't ask any questions. Frank drove me to the pad and said, tell Lupe I'll see her later on. I'm going to get some menudo. He was going to see his mistress, too. He let me off. I said, man, thank you. I was so elated. I was talking a mile a minute, and he was kind of chuckling. I wanted to kiss him. I was so happy. I walked to the house and looked around to make sure everything was okay. I've got this money sack, and I hold it behind my back. I knock on the door real quiet. We were sleeping in the front room. Diane comes to the door, sees it's me, and opens it. She says, what happened? We were really late. Frank's old lady comes and she says, is everything all right? I say, yeah. And I took this bag and I opened it and I turned it like that. And money flew all over the room. We got all the money together and counted it. We had over $1,300 in cash. That was my share. There was $3,000 or $4,000 in checks, but it remained to be seen whether I could cash any of them. As it worked out, we cashed a lot of them. When you have checks like that, you give them to certain people. You take a percentage and they take the risk. They go through them and take the ones they think they can cash on consignment, and they pay you as they cash each one. When they finish, they lay the rest back on you. We made almost $1,000 on that. So I ended up with about $2,300 for one night's work, and I felt like a real success. Author's note, $2,300 in 1960 when this took place would be worth over $25,000 in today's money in 2026. I felt that my dad would be proud of me. I wished he could have seen me and gone through the whole night with me, being aware of what was happening, what I did. I was really sick. I had forgotten all about it. Now it hit me. I said to Lupe, man, here. I laid some bread on her and I said, give me a quarter. She said, no, here. And she gave me 10 back. She gave me a quarter for $40 and it was good stuff. I put it in the spoon. I told Diane, I'm going to go first. She said, go ahead. And for about a week, we were in heaven.